Think about a name. Just one word, but it's so deeply tied to how a whole people see themselves, see their God. A name spoken with, real reverence.
Yeah. And then imagine that name, that key identifier, just sort of fading over time.
Exactly. Becoming less common, even disappearing from the version of their sacred text that most people were reading.
It's like a historical detail just vanishing. A bit of a puzzle, really.
And that sense of uncovering something important, something maybe overlooked, that's what we're doing today.
Right, we're taking a deep dive into the Septuagint. That's the very first translation of the Old Testament into Greek.
And the really fascinating part is what happened to God's personal name, Yahweh, in that whole process.
Our main source here is chapter 6 of Pasted Text, which is called Lost in Translation.
And our mission, well, it's pretty straightforward. We want to understand why this ancient translation was such a huge deal.
And also track the surprising journey of God's personal name within its pages.
Now, the author we're drawing from does give a heads up. Translation details can sometimes feel a bit, technical.
Yeah, a little dense maybe, but don't worry about that.
No, we'll guide you through it. We're focusing on the really interesting, the really captivating parts of this whole shift.
Okay, so let's get into it. Picture the time. Mid to late 3rd century BC.
A major thing happening then was the creation and then the spread of this Septuagint.
Right. The first time the Old Testament moves from Hebrew into another language, which was Greek.
And its importance, you really can't overstate it.
No, absolutely not. The Septuagint wasn't just, a translation. It became the version for a massive part of the world for centuries.
Even used widely within Jewish communities for a good while.
Now, the story of how it actually happened is quite something. Maybe more legend than strict history, but still.
Oh yeah, the traditional story. Ptolemy II Philadelphus in Egypt wants all the world's books for his library in Alexandria.
That's the one. And supposedly he asks the high priest in Jerusalem to send scholars.
To translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek.
And legend says 72 elders arrive and tackle this huge project, starting with the Torah, the first 5 books.
72. Quite an undertaking.
Definitely. But for us today, the key question is, how did these translators handle Yahweh's name, the personal name of God?
Yeah, and as our source material highlights, it's not a simple answer. It actually changed quite a bit over time.
Right, so the Torah translation seems to have happened fairly quickly.
But the rest of the Old Testament, that took decades. Different people, different places working on it.
And that's really crucial, because it means there wasn't just one single consistent way they dealt with the name.
It makes you think about the basic challenge, moving between languages with totally different alphabets, different structures.
Oh, absolutely. The source gives a neat example. Just look at the word alphabet itself in English, then Hebrew, then Greek.
You see it immediately. Different writing systems entirely.
Exactly. So a title like Adonai, which means Lord, well, you can find a Greek word, kurios, that basically means the same thing.
But Yahweh, that's a proper name. It's unique. There's no direct Greek equivalent just sitting there.
It's a bit like, remember when the artist Prince changed his name to that symbol?
Oh, yeah. The unpronounceable symbol.
Right. How do you write that? How do you represent it easily? The Septuagint translators had a similar kind of puzzle with Yahweh.
So how did they represent this really important name in a different script, especially early on?
Well, initially they tried several pretty interesting things. Shows they were thinking hard about it.
Okay, like what?
One way was transliteration. Basically trying to spell out the sound of the Hebrew name using Greek letters.
So taking the Hebrew letters Yod, He, Wah, He, and Yahweh.
And representing them with Greek letters that sound similar. Often it was iota, alpha, omega, a.
IAW. So if you were reading that Greek text aloud.
You'd likely say something pretty close to Yahweh that keeps the sound,
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Sometimes they were more indirect. They'd signal the name was supposed to be there without writing it.
How?
Some early manuscripts just have a blank space where Yahweh's name was in the Hebrew.
A literal gap in the text.
Yep. Or sometimes they use 4 dots, like this.
Huh?
Or other little marks or abbreviations. A visual cue.
Okay, so they knew something important belonged there.
Exactly. And then, and this is really fascinating,
Go on.
some early translators actually inserted the original Hebrew letters directly into the Greek text.
Wait, really? Like you're reading along in Greek and suddenly there's...
Or even the older Paleo-Hebrew script, AA, right there in the middle of the Greek sentence.
Wow. That just screams reverence, doesn't it? A real effort to keep the name itself.
It really does. These early methods, they strongly suggest the first translators were very concerned about losing the personal name of God in the translation.
And the evidence shows these methods were common in the oldest copies we have. They stuck around for a while.
Things change, practices evolve.
Uh-huh. Over time, there was a definite shift in how the name was handled.
Yeah, and the source connects this change to that growing Jewish tradition, the one about not saying Yahweh's name aloud anymore.
Right, substituting Adonai, meaning Lord, whenever reading the scriptures publicly.
Exactly. So as Jewish communities outside Judea, who were often more fluent in Greek than Hebrew, got more involved in copying and transmitting these texts.
Let me guess, they started putting that substitution into the written text.
You got it. Instead of transliterating Eddie, or leaving a space, or using the Hebrew letters, they started replacing Yahweh's name with the Greek word Kyrios.
Kyrios, which also means Lord, same meaning as Adonai.
Precisely. So the name wasn't just being avoided when spoken.
In the most popular translation, it was actually being written out, replaced by a title.
It's a pretty profound shift when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is. Our source lays it out clearly. First, reverence for the name Yahweh.
Then the verbal substitution, saying Adonai.
Then those early Greek translation efforts trying to preserve the name somehow.
And finally, the widespread switch to just writing Kyrios Lord instead.
And the author we're using, they raise an interesting question, even hinting that maybe this wasn't entirely accidental, like a potential scheme to obscure the name more broadly.
It's definitely a thought-provoking perspective. Looking at the end result, you can see why someone might suggest that.
So why was this translation into Greek happening anyway? Why was it so needed?
Well, you got to remember the historical context. The Greco-Roman Empire was expanding massively.
And Greek became the common language, right? The lingua franca.
Absolutely. All across that vast territory, including Judea itself.
We even see that in the New Testament, don't we? That inscription Pilate put on the cross.
Exactly. Written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. It shows you how common Greek was in daily life, even there.
So for Jews living outside Israel in the diaspora,
fluency in Hebrew was often declining. They needed the scriptures in a language they understood well.
Which was increasingly Greek, so they relied more and more on the Septuagint.
And then comes early Christianity. It explodes, spreads rapidly among non-Jews, Gentiles.
And their Old Testament. It was primarily the Septuagint.
Right. So you end up with this situation. The original Hebrew Bible still has Yahweh's name all through it, thousands of times.
But the Septuagint, the version most people were reading, especially non-Jews,
increasingly just had Kyrios Lord. The personal name wasn't visible in the same way.
So think about the impact of that. What does it mean when the personal name is missing from the version most people access?
Could it lead to maybe a less personal understanding of God for those communities? It's a question worth asking.
But okay, there's another side to this, a really important one the source brings up.
Yes. Even while the name Yahweh was becoming less visible in the Septuagint,
this very translation was the vehicle spreading knowledge about the God of Israel to totally new groups of people who'd never encountered him.
Gentiles reading these Greek scriptures and learning about him for the first time. The author calls this unspeakably amazing.
And it was. I mean, that spread of knowledge is incredible.
Absolutely. So it's complex, isn't it? You got this amazing expansion of knowledge about God happening.
But at the same time, this potential obscuring of his personal name.
Does the gain outweigh the loss? Or is it more complicated?
The author uses this analogy I thought was quite powerful. It's like, after a huge battle, a great victory, once the dust settles, you celebrate, but then you also take stock. What did we lose to achieve this win? What was the cost?
Right. Assessing the damage the sacrifices made along the way.
It reminds me of that scene in Ezra when they're rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem after the exile.
Oh, yeah. A moment of great joy. God's faithfulness shown.
But it says the older priests and Levites, the ones who remembered Solomon's original temple, they wept loudly.
Why? Because this new temple, while wonderful, just didn't compare to the glory of the first one. They remembered what had been lost.
So their joy was mixed with this real grief. It shows that even in moments of progress, real losses can happen, things that diminish the fullness of what could be.
That's a really insightful connection. So applying that here, maybe even as God's message was spreading, something valuable was being diminished regarding his name.
Well, the author suggests something along those lines, that maybe even as Satan was facing this huge defeat through Christ and the spread of the gospel, He might have found sort of, I don't know, grim satisfaction. A wicked, cruel smile, the author says.
Because God's actual personal name had become significantly obscured in the main text people were using.
Exactly. In the very scriptures that were telling the world about him.
Wow. That's a sobering thought. It really is.
It makes you realize how subtle shifts, even amidst great things, can change our connection to something fundamental.
Yeah. So as you, our listener, think about all this, here's something to mull over.
We know God is Lord, and that's powerful and true. But what might have been gained or perhaps lost because his personal name, Yahweh, became less visible, less used.
What does that tell us about names, about personal connection, and maybe about the depth of relationship possible?
Something to really chew on.